All right, that's a little better. So yeah, now I can at least now we can all see everyone's comments while I'm talking. But yeah, so we'll get started with the topic for today. So the topic for today is it's still along the CSS line, but it's CSS in the way of how it's used to do layout. So the last one was about making things look better than just basic HTML. Actually putting styles around things, making things more colorful, more responsive, and responsive in the way of mouse overs, hovers, things like that. That kind of responsive, because there's multiple types of responsive, as I'm sure you know. Which is another thing we're going to talk about today. We are going to talk about responsive design in layouts and how CSS can be used to do layout. And we're going to discover two different types of layouts. We're going to discuss Flexbox, which is probably one of the most common ones, and we're going to discuss grid layout. Um, Oddly enough, I was doing some research over the last couple of days, like I always do for all of my streams, and ran across the fact that grid itself can actually be responsive as well. So even though you can define a certain number of actual cells, if you were in the grid, if those cells overflow your current viewport, they can wrap. So they can wrap and they can be responsive. And of course, they attempt while they're within the constraints to adjust and all that kind of stuff. There's some pretty interesting things in there that I'd seen before and didn't really know what they meant. So I had to do a lot of research as well. So hopefully there's still be some learning in that as well. So yeah, I think without too much ado, we're getting good people. We're getting at least a number of people here. I think I'll go ahead and hide the chat overlay for now, but I want to bring it up for me. There it is. At least I can see what you're saying. So yeah, we might as well get on to the code. The first one we're going to do is Flexbox responsive design, and then I've got a separate example for grid layout. I don't want to try to combine them together. I thought it looked too wonky and maybe not the easiest way to share things. So we'll go ahead and we will get into. I was asked if there's going to be a dog interruption, and I think we're about ready to have a dog interruption. Yes, we are. It looks like it. I was asked if there'd be a dog interruption. I said I bet there probably would. The pit bull knows when I'm doing stuff, when I'm doing something that's important. And sure enough, hey, get over here. And sure enough, he was the one. He was the one who went out there to the fence, and it looks like he's thinking about doing it again. Buck, come on. Why don't you stay here? There we go. Gotta be very gentle with him. He's a pit bull, but he gets so easily upset. He's such a baby. Okay. Anyways, on with the code. So here we go. Yeah, there you go. There, share the screen. Here's our first example. So our first example is basically responsive design. As per usual with me, I don't try to make things look super fancy, mainly because I just don't have the time. But also the idea behind this is to give very basic examples so that you can kind of see what's being done and figure the rest out yourself. Because let's be honest, that's where the real learning takes place. You need someone to impart the basic wisdom to you, but in the end, you really need to dig in and figure it out for yourself. So we got a pretty basic layout here. Couple of divs, container div with a couple paragraph divs. I'm just calling them paragraphs because technically there were two paragraphs in here, but I kind of lost the spacing when I was working inside of Code Sandbox here. Not a big deal. The idea is still there, the concept at least. So container and paragraph, that's pretty much all we got here. This is pretty basic overall. Border box is just making sure it helps with flexbox sizing and things of that nature. It's a certain way in which this is the thing I didn't research for the stream. I do remember sort of what border box means, but you can go and look up what the box sizing. There's a couple different box sizings. One of them is border box. For flex box, this is the one that should probably be on. And I think most of the frameworks that are out there right now set this by a default. I think the border box is the default that most frameworks use, including let's see here, the one I was using, which is oh good gosh, now I can't remember it. Yeah, that one. Tailwind. There we go. Tailwind. Yes, it was Tailwind I was thinking of. So yeah, they use border box. I think, like I said, most of them do because it works better with a lot of the Flexbox. And Flexbox is the one that you'll see used in a lot of responsive design. The main reason for that is because it allows things to be flexible in Flexbox based upon the amount of input and all those kinds of things. In this case, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a desktop version of the site and also a mobile version of the site. Now in here as well, I also used the new media query syntax as well. So some pretty decent learning in here. Basically, the container, as you saw, which is the divs surrounding all of this here, all of this here, the div surrounding that is set to display flex, and flex wrap is set to wrap. Basically, it'll wrap if it gets to a point where it can't display side by side any longer. And we're telling it when it can't go side by side. So basically, in normal non-mobile settings, we want each paragraph to take up 50% of the page. So we give flex 50%. So basically, it will take up half the page. Now, flex can be a percentage. If I'm right, you can even use numbers. If I remember right, like if you have like 3, you could say, let's say you had 3 different items here. You could say 1, 2, 1, and the middle one would take up 2 spots, while the right ones would take up 1 spot. So they'll divide the space evenly between them based upon the number of the number within flex. So if there's 3 of them and flex is 1 for each one of those columns, then each one will take up 33 and a third percent. If it's like what I said, 1, 2, 1, then the one in the middle, of course, would take up 50%, and the right 2 would take up 25%. So Flexbox is kind of a good word for it because it's very flexible in the way you can use a lot of the different features and things like that. I simply put a padding of 4 because when I didn't have it in there, it was hard to tell where one began and the other one ended. It kind of just crammed them all together, and you couldn't see that there was actually a division here. So that was really just for the presentation. It has nothing to do with anything else. But as we get to where the width is less than 600 pixels, basically then we are going to then invert it to where each paragraph now takes up 100%. And you'll see it here as I actually decrease the size. Once I get to where it's less than 600 pixels, now the 2 paragraphs are one on top of another. And as we scroll back out, they go back to where they're side by side. So we're setting 600 pixels as our I guess that would be maximum width, I guess, for a mobile device. It can be different for everyone. Some people put them a little bit higher. You can put it however you want to. There's many of the frameworks out there, like Tailwind and other ones. They have their own settings. Tailwind has, I think it's extra small, medium large, and extra large, I think. And they have their own default settings, but inside of Tailwind, there's a configuration file. You can actually set those settings if you wish to. So you can set each one to its particular height. You don't have to use pixels. I'm using pixels because it was easier for me to do. I didn't want to have to calculate the rims, but you could use rims, which are probably a better way of doing things, especially, like I said, when it comes to determining when certain things hit. I actually for the width here, it's probably not a bad idea to use pixels, since rims are really meant to be used for when things adjust. Rims are really good for things like fonts and things like that, so that when you get into a mobile situation, the font actually looks bigger, because a lot of times, like I've said, when you get into a mobile situation, the buttons that you have that would look fine and work perfectly fine on desktop will no longer work very well on a mobile device, because you have to hit it with your finger. So if you have this little itty bitty button about this big, it's harder to hit your finger than if you have a much bigger and much rounder button. It's a lot easier to push those things. That's where a lot of these things come in. So pretty basic, pretty easy example here. nothing that I would consider too complex to understand. Like I said, this is the new media query. It used to be, let's see here, I believe it was min width, max width is what it used to be, which was a little confusing because you had to kind of figure out, okay, is min width going to be where the mobile crosses over, or is it the minimum width before, is it the minimum width to become desktop? So, and what does max width mean and all that? And so I really like that they went to this style. This style is more, feels more programming like almost. It makes sense. Width is less than or equal to 600 pixels. So I'm saying if my current width is at least 600 pixels or less, then I want to set my paragraph to 100%. I love this. When someone posted this about a month or two ago on X, and I was like, oh my gosh, thank goodness for this, because I always, every time I had to handwrite media queries, I wanted to pull my hair out, just trying to remember what's what and how to get things going. It would take me a little while to remember all that stuff. But yeah, now with this in there, it's really nice. It's nice to have a more easier way, and you can do not only this. Let me see if I can find that article, because you can do between this and this. So this new format allows you to do kind of the between one and another. I'm wondering if I still have it. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Good. There's some other CSS media query stuff that came out as well. When else, and some other cool stuff too. Let me get to the important part here that I'm trying to show, and then I'll switch screens for you. Here we go. Here's what I'm talking about. So we will go ahead and switch screens real quick. No, we're going to replace, and we're going to go to this, and we're going to share. And so here's what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about, where you can say, you can test between two widths. So if you want to say if it's between one width or another, here is the actual way that you can do the whole between one width. 500 pixels is greater than the width, was greater than or equal to the width, or I guess in that case it would be less than or equal to, and the width is less than or equal to 800 pixels. Yeah. So yeah, basically it's between 500 pixels and 800 pixels. So really interesting stuff. Some interesting stuff we've got in here. This is where, here's the old style that I was talking about, the whole max width and min width stuff. This is how it used to be. And like I said, it always confused me a little bit, because when you're trying to do something, you're trying to figure out, is it this, is it that? Here's where I want it to be less than or equal to 800 pixels. So that makes sense to me, instead of trying to say min width. But that's me. I'm going to jump back over before I kill that screen. And we'll jump back over to here, because I've got my other example here as well. Okay. So once again, pretty basic, nothing too complex here. Display flex, set it to wrap so that it'll actually wrap. Because if not, if you don't put flex wrap in there, when you do this, what'll happen is this thing will just get smaller and smaller and smaller, and you'll get to here and you'll have these itty bitty little things about this big, and they'll still be fighting each other trying to get there. So you need to tell it's okay to wrap, basically. So you tell it's okay to wrap, and then you give it the whole width 600 pixels, and make sure that the paragraph actually takes up, the entirety of the window at that width or smaller. And that's really the whole idea of responsive design, is making something that works both on desktop and on mobile. So what we do now is I will actually go back here, and I've got my grid CSS example that I did. This one mimics my date time component to a point. This is pretty much how I did my date time component, at least the calendar portion of the date time component. Let's see here. I can see you. In case you're wondering, I just don't always come back over here to check on who's giving messages. So I'm glad to see that you're here. Thoughts on Tailwind? There's a lot of fights back and forth on Tailwind. I don't get involved in those fights. I don't. I'll say this much. I've been doing software development for 24 years now, and almost the entirety of that time was spent in the web development world. I mean, I've been doing web since before it was really even something popular to do. Back in the days when we still had the CGI bin. If anyone remembers those days, I'm willing to bet there might be at least one person who remembers the CGI bin. Anyways, um, so I've been in a lot of different situations, and long before there were things like SCSS and SAS and all of those different preprocessors and all of those things, and before things like Bootstrap. That's another one I was trying to come up with. Before Bootstrap and Tailwind and all of them, I did a lot of projects where you had to manage a lot of you had to manage a lot of CSS files. And even when you're using Bootstrap, even when you're, well, maybe not so much in Bootstrap, but even when you're using certain things, yeah, less, there's a good one. Less is another one. And so even when you're doing all of those things, you have to manage a lot of files. And especially if you're going to get into a point where you're going to have themes, as soon as you bring themes into the list, you've just made things 10 times more complicated for yourself. You really have. And so that just brings the complexity level up even more, and how much you have to manage more. And the problem I've always had with doing things like straight CSS, especially in bigger projects, is you forget what classes you have that do certain things. And so what you end up doing is you end up rewriting a lot of classes because you've got such a large library of all these classes. And I've seen so many different things tried. I've seen people try things like BEM. I can't remember what BEM stands for. I was in one project where we did it, and I hated it. And I've heard a lot of people who hate it too. So thank goodness I wasn't the only one who hated it. Um, there's just so many things you try to do to help manage things, and it seems like a lot of times you end up with a lot of duplication of CSS. And that's never a good thing, to have a bunch of things written about the same stuff, or you have to have these little itty bitty one-offs that oh well, this is slightly different, this is slightly different, so I've got to write a new one because I need it to do this instead of this. With Tailwind, what happens is Tailwind is basically CSS. Each style you're writing is basically, there you go, block element modifier. Thank you. That's what BEM stands for. So here we go. That's BEM, by the way, for anyone. Yes. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Shri. Um, so basically, yes, Tailwind is basically each style you apply usually is a one-for-one mapping to an actual CSS property. That's not always true. You're going to see something here that I'll show you. I actually pulled from what's it called, from Tailwind for my component, because the next example I used some of the Tailwind styles for my component and just kind of took them and applied them directly inside of here. And you'll see there are some things that do get applied, but it's pretty much a one-for-one mapping. So what you can do is you can say, okay, well, I need to apply all these things, and people say, well, you're littering your code base with all of these styles and all this stuff. There are nice tools to do that. There's one I use called class name. I think it's singular, class name, that allows you to group different styles together. And so therefore you don't have it all sitting inside of the class property. You have it, into this actual variable reference, if you're using something like React, or I'm sure it works just fine in Angular as well. And so you can then have certain styles turned on based upon certain properties, and what it does, what class names does, it's actually very simple. I think if I looked at the code one time, and I think it's like 20 or 30 lines. I don't think it's a lot of code, but all it really basically does is it does comparisons, like Boolean level comparisons on the properties you're passing in, and based upon what different settings are, certain classes and certain things will appear. And so it keeps it nice and condensed, in my opinion. And then it makes using something like Tailwind very convenient, because then you don't have all of this littering, where you have these class names that are running, 3 paragraphs long or something like that, but they're all kind of contained in there. And to me, there's one thing that Adam Wathan, and I don't know if he personally put it on the site, of course, but on their site, and it's a quote from him. He said something to the effect of, if you can stop complaining about Tailwind long enough, you'll actually like it. And he's right. If you can actually just use it and just realize that it's so much easier to do than sitting there and trying to maintain all of this crap, all of these these huge files of CSS, and trying to remember, oh, this class needs to be applied in this situation, especially when you get to larger projects. Maybe people who haven't had these problems, maybe they've been in smaller projects. But in larger projects, this happens more times than I'd want to know. and or then you would want to know. Then I do. Then I want to remember. Let's just put it that way. And so, yes, I think Tailwind is a really great library to use. I use it in all my personal projects. We use it at my full time client, which is Myosh. We use it there in everything we do. Everything we do. When we started the project there, I was one of two developers that started that project, and that was one of the things we said we wanted to use Tailwind. So we did, and honestly, I haven't had a single problem that I've found from using it, and I've liked the fact that it keeps things. I know where things are, and yes, I know there's now different ways to give block definitions to styles, and you can pick your own, but I like Tailwind. I've gone way too overboard with that, but you asked me to like something, you asked me to talk about something that I actually like to do, and that's something that I like to bring up is as I do think it's worth the investment in time to learn Tailwind. And they've got a really great site, and honestly, there's a lot of really nice stuff that you can do. This, speaking of Tailwind, this whole thing you see here, I took directly from Tailwind for my date time component. Um, this is grid layout. Now, as I was researching grid layout, basically this can be used in a responsive way as well, but it just depends on how you set it up. Um, what you see here is basically this is defining that you are using grid layout. We have here. I'll quickly do this. Here's the way that the actual CSS or the actual HTML looks. The calendar, which is the wrapper, the header cells, and then the actual date cells. So there we go. That's our different items, and they're all in a row here. And so what we do inside of the grid layout to tell us how this should be laid out is we use grid template columns. I hate the way it continually does that. Is we use the grid template columns. And so grid template columns tells us how many columns there needs to be and what their definitions are. So how big they should be, things of that nature. This function is the repeat function. Now the repeat function, basically here, I'll quickly show you what I could have done. So without the repeat function, what I could have done to do the same thing, let's see if it'll let me do this. Maybe it won't. Here, we might just have to do it like this. I could have done, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, if we save this, it should look the same. As we see, no change whatsoever. So that's what repeat did, basically. Repeat basically did exactly what I just did there. So that's what repeat does. Repeat basically will say, do this a certain number of times. So if you have a repeatable piece of CSS that you want to do, this isn't specific necessarily to grid template columns. It can be used anywhere where you want to repeat something, where you need multiple items within a property and you want to repeat them over and over again. It's probably used mostly in grid template columns, I'd be willing to guess. In this case, we use min max. I'm not entirely sure that the min here ever gets used. It's 0. I don't see a single cell, even this cell here that has 0 in it, but 1FR. Now, I would always see this. I'm saying, what does 1FR mean? I actually had to look it up. I'd used this for years in my date time component and just let it just assume that, just said, okay, it must be something. What it means is one frame or one fraction. There's the right word, one fraction. So what does that mean? Well, that means here we set up 7 grid template columns, each taking one fraction. So what we do is the grid here, since we aren't giving it a size, takes up the entirety of the page. If you'll notice, as I scroll, it gets bigger and smaller, so the grid grows. So that's what one fraction does. What one fraction says, it takes the entire space that the grid's going to take up. We're saying that we have 7 one fractions, so it divides each of these into 1/7 of the space that we're asking for here. So that's what FR stands for, is fraction. Now you don't have to say 1; you can say 2 if you wish. You could actually do this differently. I saw a good example when I was reading through this, where they did 3 and they did. So you could say, I wouldn't do this, but you could say 1FR, 2FR. You could do that with repeat, for example, if you wish to. So it doesn't have to be, I'm not sure if that would work with min max, so don't quote me on that. But if you didn't have min max in there and you just had the repeat. You could do 1FR, 2FR, and it would repeat both of those in succession as many times as you ask them to be repeated. So that's what repeat does. So you know, and that's how the fraction part here works. As you see an example here, this actual, I don't know if you can read that or not, but it doesn't really help very much. It talks about track sizing and lists of names, and I had to actually dig in a little bit and do a little bit of research to find out what that meant, and so I could explain it, because that right there, the explanation that it gives is not very helpful. So basically, that's what it means. It takes up a percentage of the whole. So whatever the whole is, it takes, in this case, 1/7 of the whole. Gap, I'm not entirely sure. Gap does give a little bit of spacing. It's basically, there's some spacing between each one of these. So in this case, it probably wouldn't matter much if we did that and then we saved. See, it doesn't do that much, but as you see, the numbers went up and they got a lot shorter. So not really the very prettiest looking thing. Having the gap in there does make it look nice. So it puts space around the individual cells so that there's some spacing in there. Now, if you don't want that, you don't need the gap, but that's what that's for. Now, header cells is pretty obvious. We're bolding and centering. And then with the data cells, we're just plain centering. Now, we don't really care much about anything else here. I mean, I suppose I could have tried to do that and make it look a little bit more like an actual date time selector, you know, where it wouldn't do it here, but it would do it here. So I could have done stuff like that. But in the end, yeah, that's pretty much how grid works, what grid is used for. Let me see here. I think I have, yeah, in a lot of my posts before this live stream today, I did show an example of my date time component. I actually do have the date time component up, but I don't really think it's worth showcasing, because it would take a little bit to actually get it running and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not too sure that would be really worth it. Let me see here. Teach you one-on-one how to code. I kind of agree with that Jaylene there, that going step by step is definitely the way to go. If you, I always throw this out at the end of the streams. We're getting close to the end right now. That if anyone needs any help from me, wants any help, they can always hit me up. If you, I don't know if you're on X, but if you're on X, my name's pretty much the same as it is here, just with a or an underscore between them. So Brandon_Traven. You can always hit me up there. I'm always willing to help out in any way possible. That's part of the reason why I do this. So definitely willing to help out. And I definitely agree with you that doing a project is probably one of the best ways to learn something. Here, we'll go ahead, and I don't think I need to share anymore. So that means then what I can do is I can kick this back into the overlay, and we can keep that there for just a little while longer. There we go. And then I did say, so here we've hit a 30-minute mark. So I'm going to go ahead just for myself. So when I cut this, I've got a good stopping point.